If you joined us last week in our service, you will probably have noticed that there was a little glitch in the message component of our service. And I just wanted to make up for that glitch, because even though we got the video right, we didn't quite get the audio right. And you might have noticed that at one point during the message, we cut away to where I was sitting in my office. And the reason we did that was after we shot the original video, I ended up getting a health update that I wanted to share with you. And even though we shot the video, it never actually made its way to sharing with you. So I wanted to give it to you today. And here's the health update. 3 weeks ago, I had a PET scan, which some of you know, and I was waiting for results, and I finally got the results of that PET scan. And what we were hoping for was that the PET scan would show where in my body the cancer was growing, and it did. It showed that I have a small spot on the right side of my neck, and they took the results to a panel, and the panel has recommended that I have surgery to remove that spot, which is probably a lymph node. And so after I got off the phone with my oncologist, my surgeon actually called, and through God's providence, they told me that the next day that they had an opening that I could come in and talk to the surgeon. So I did. And by the time I left the office that day, I had received a surgery date already. And so on December 10th, I will be going under the knife to remove this cancerous spot in my neck. And if it was like the last time I had surgery, there will be about a 2-week recovery period. And last time my voice was affected for longer than 2 weeks, actually. And so what does this mean? It means that I will be off during Christmas. Not that that's a bad thing, being off, but recovering from surgery, yippee, just at the right time at Christmas, right? And so that means the rest of our team will be stepping up and filling some of the roles that I would normally fill at Christmas. So I just want to thank you. Thank you for praying for me. Thank you for praying for my family. I ask that you pray for the staff who will be stepping in to do some of the preaching work in December and some of the other things that they have to cover for me while I am off. And so that's the update. So now I want to jump into the message for this week. In 1996, a movie came out. And this movie had a line, what became a famous line that really defined the movie. And for many people, it actually became almost a statement of life. And so in this movie, Jerry is living a fabulous life. Everything seems to be going well. He's having a great time. And then everything starts to crash around him and his fabulous life disappears. And in this journey, he discovers Dorothy. And by the end of the movie, he realizes it's Dorothy who's going to make him happy. And so there's this climactic scene at the end of the movie where he's standing in Dorothy's house in her living room, and he admits that he loves her, and then he says this line, "You complete me." And as Tom Cruise's character is blubbering along, Dorothy, played by Renee Zellweger, tells him, "Shut up, shut up." And what's her line? You probably know it. "You had me at hello." Since that time, both those lines from Jerry Maguire have become memes, have become punchlines, have become statements at weddings even. And so some of it's been lost over the 25 years since that movie came out. But when that movie came out, that scene, I think, for every single female that watched that movie for the very first time, caused them to swoon. Because, of course, that's how it's supposed to be, right? That's how someone's supposed to profess their love to them. While the married women who saw the movie, they just snorted because they know reality, right? This line of "you complete me" kind of captures how our society looks at romance and captures this ideal, this concept of a soulmate. And this idea that when you're growing up and you're single, you have to go on this search to find that one person who will bring it all together and complete you and make you happy. Where does this idea of a soulmate come from? Many people point back actually as far as Plato. And in Plato, in his work Symposium, this is what Plato writes. Let me read it to you. "Humans were originally created with 4 arms, 4 legs, and a head with 2 faces. Fearing their power, Zeus split them into two separate beings, condemning them to spend their lives in search of their other half. And then he adds, love is simply the name for the desire and pursuit of the whole. And so this idea is embedded in our culture, in our kind of our awareness that if Plato was right, then we need to find our soulmate. And what Plato is saying that is without your soulmate, you're really only half a person. You will never feel whole. You will never be complete until you find that other person. Some Christians believe that a soulmate is actually a biblical concept, and they often point to Genesis 2:24, where God says that when a man is united with his wife, they become one flesh. But God's equation is very different from Plato's equation, if you think about it. You see, Plato's equation goes like this. 1/2 plus 1/2 equals what? 1. God's equation is 1 plus 1 equals 1. You see, when Plato thinks about this concept of a soulmate, and if he were to use the language, you complete me when you find that other half, what he's saying is if you can't find that other half, you will never be completed. Or what if you pick the wrong half to start with? What then? You will never be whole. That's part of his thinking. You need that one person that will make you complete and whole. And so if you mistakenly pick the wrong one, then of course, divorce them, because you will never be happy until you find the one that completes you. Unfortunately, this idea or this sense of trying to find a soulmate to complete you, I think ends up creating a lot of psychological problems for us. Whereas God's formula of 1 plus 1 equals 1 is a lot different. And there's this bringing together, in his formula, there's these bringing together of two complete people, although they're sinful and selfish. And marriage is this concept of bringing them together and helping them to understand that marriage requires self-sacrifice. Marriage requires you to come to the place where you love that other person and you're willing to put them first. It's a picture of selfless love. That's how you will find this wholeness in marriage. But it still means that even if you don't get married, you're still a one. You don't need a spouse to become whole. I think this concept of you complete me is actually a symptom of something deeper that our culture struggles with, that we struggle with. Because there is truth to the statement that we are not complete in and of ourselves. We are searching for something. We look for something to fill us, to make us who we think we need to become. And so some of you are thinking, okay, Brent, how does this relate to Philippians chapter 1? Well, let's look at the verses we're going to look at today and we'll find out. So I'm going to read from chapter 1 of Philippians, verse 19, all the way down to verse 26. And this is what it says. For I know, and this is Paul speaking, for I know that through your prayers and God's provision of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, what has happened to me will turn out for my deliverance. I eagerly expect and hope that I will in no way be ashamed, but will have sufficient courage so that now, as always, Christ will be exalted in my body, whether by life or by death. For to me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain. If I am going on living in the body, this will mean fruitful labor for me. Yet what shall I choose? I do not know. I am torn between the two. I desire to depart to be with Christ, which is better by far. But it is more necessary for you that I remain in the body. Convinced of this, I know that I will remain, and I will continue with all of you for your progress and joy in the faith, so that through my being with you again, your boasting in Christ Jesus will abound on account of me. Just a reminder, Paul is actually in prison, as we found out last week, in writing this letter to the Philippian church. He is awaiting a trial, and he is still able, even in the midst of that hardship, to see how God is working in his life. And part of what excites him is that the message of the gospel is still being preached. And in the midst of these circumstances, he's still able to find joy. And in fact, verse 18, the previous verse, tells us that he rejoices. He rejoices. And then it moves into verse 19 where you get this sense that Paul is just confident in his situation, even though it's not great. He's just confident about what's going on. So what gives him this confidence? Verse 19, I think, tells us that there's two places where Paul finds his confidence regardless of the circumstances that he's in. The first one comes from the prayers of the Philippian church, and the second one is God's provision of the Spirit of Jesus Christ. Both of these seem to be very important to Paul. And I can understand why. When you think about prayer, one of the things that happens when you know people are praying for you is you know that you're not alone. You know that people are caring for you because they're praying for you. You know that people are going to God on your behalf, coming to God with whatever you're struggling with. They're going to God for you. So it's not just you. This is a reminder, I think, that Paul gives us that the spiritual life has never meant to be just an individualistic thing. There is a huge component of our spiritual life that needs to be community. That's why I struggle when people don't let others into their life, and especially share the things that they should be prayed for. Now, sometimes that means getting prayer in front of the whole church. Like me, I've chosen to be very open about my journey with cancer, and I'm more than happy for people to pray for me. I actually love it, and it encourages me. Others, though, often their forum for getting prayed for is with their community group or with a small group of friends. And that's still great. That's what Paul, I think, is telling us to do. He's confident even in the midst of being in prison because he knows the church is praying for him. And then he adds this second piece, and it's the confidence that comes because of the Spirit of Jesus that God has given him. And he knows that it is Jesus who enables him to have peace when his world is collapsing around him. He knows that Jesus is the one who gives him hope when everything looks so dark. He also knows that Jesus is the one who gives him strength every day. He's also the one who gives him sleep in the midst of anxiety. And so you read verse 19 and you just hear this confidence coming out of Paul, and he gets to the end of it and he says, has happened to me will turn out for my deliverance. This word deliverance in some translations is translated salvation. And I think Paul wholeheartedly believes that he is going to be delivered or saved. And yet we struggle with what he might understand this to be. You see, many think that Paul believed that he would get out of prison. I'm not so sure that that's what Paul meant when he said he was going to be delivered in this case. And in verse 20, he goes on and he talks about how he eagerly expects and hopes, and it describes, how he's feeling and what he's looking at. He goes, basically, I know God is going to act. And then he adds this line where he talks about, in no way be ashamed. I don't want to be ashamed. I want to have sufficient courage to do what I need to do. This means, I think, that Paul knows that a hard road lies ahead. He still has to go before Caesar. His life is still on the line. There is still hardships that he's going to have to go through. As Christians, we will often find ourselves in situations where we, in order to be cool in front of everyone, or in order to not lose face, we will say things or not say things that Jesus wouldn't want us to do or want us to say. And this is where oftentimes we find ourselves as Christians, where later on we're ashamed because we didn't speak up, or we just said some things or laughed at an off-color joke when we shouldn't have. And we get into those moments where we go, oh, Jesus, I failed you again. And you feel ashamed at that. I didn't stand up for someone when I should have stood up for them. I think sometimes we get this feeling when we go to our 10-year high school reunion anniversary, right? At 10 years, you're in there with everyone else that you went to high school, and you're kind of measuring yourself against the other people there. And for some, you don't measure up because they've accomplished way more than you. Or for others, you're ashamed because you gained way more weight than they have. Or maybe you're still single and everyone else is married. There's things that cause us to feel ashamed of our lives or how we look or what we have done or haven't done. And it's in those moments where we know what it is to feel kind of that shame and be ashamed. And Paul is basically saying, look, I'm in a tough situation, but I want to act so that I'm not ashamed at the end. I need to be courageous. I need to be bold. And here's the thing. Here's the attitude I think that we need to have when it comes to life. We need to be just like Paul and say, hey, I'm eagerly expecting and hoping that in no way will I be ashamed, but that I will have sufficient courage to do what I need to do. And in many ways, that's really what I was hoping last week when we talked about our Christmas wonder boxes and how I'm encouraging our church to step out and live this aspect of our new vision of taking a risk and trying to live bravely outward. To do that, it requires us to be courageous. It requires us to be brave. And it requires us to take a step. Because at the end of the day, I don't want you to arrive on Christmas Day and have that momentary twinge where you go, I know I should have done this. I should have given that person a box. I should have invited them to the Christmas Eve service. And so if you didn't listen to last week's message, I encourage you to listen to last week's message. And in that message, I encouraged everyone to pray. Pray from now until December 5th and ask God to just place on your heart someone that you need to reveal Jesus to this Christmas. And so here's the reminder for those of you who were with us last week, continue to pray. Continue to do that every day. And then Paul gets into this strange thing. He says at the end of verse 20, that Christ will be exalted in my body, whether by life or by death. If you have no idea what that means, don't feel bad. It's sentences like that make Christians look a little weird to our world outside, I think. So what is Paul trying to say that Christ will be exalted in my body? What does that even mean? I think there's a couple of things that if we take time to think about it, it will make sense to us. First, I think this shows that when Paul is talking about deliverance, it's not necessarily that he's talking about deliverance from jail. He may be talking about deliverance from this life. And so he will be saved whether he stays in jail or whether he dies, whether in life or death. Paul knows that he's going to be freed. He's going to be either freed from jail or he's going to be freed from this life. And either of those options is okay with him. And then second, he talks about Christ being exalted in his body. What does this mean? The word exalted could also be translated magnified or glorified. And in many older English translations, they actually use the word magnify. And so part of this question is, if it can be translated glorified, what does it mean to bring glory to God with our body? Because we can't do anything for God that brings him more glory. So what is Paul saying? I love how one commentator puts this. Whatever force we exercise for him, meaning God, adds nothing to God's power. Whatever glory we offer contributes nothing to his unexcelled glory. He is made not one bit richer by our gifts, or one whit poorer by our withholding. All power, all glory, and all riches are his. We can't do anything that adds to God's glory. So how do we understand this verse? I love this translation, the word magnify. When you think of the word magnify, what does the word magnify mean? It means to make an object appear larger or to increase the effect of the object. We talk about magnification when we talk about microscopes or telescopes. And Paul wants us to understand that he lives his life in a way that allows people to see Jesus better because they know him. He magnifies Jesus to other people. This idea of a telescope, of us being a telescope, is used by a number of people to explain this verse. When you use a telescope, what are you doing? You're looking at a star that is miles and miles, millions of miles away, and it's just a little pinprick of light. But if you're able to actually look at the star and get closer to it, you realize that that little bit of light is actually a massive ball of firing liquid fire. There's heat, there's power, there's light coming off that thing. And just because we can't see it closely doesn't diminish what it actually is. And so this sense of magnifying Jesus means that we are called, and that's just what Paul's calling us, we are called to live our lives in such a way that when people see us, they actually get a picture of Jesus. Our job as Jesus followers is to help magnify God to others, so that when they look at us, they actually see God in our lives. God, in essence, becomes closer to them, more real, more magnified in their life. It increases the effect of God in the world. You see, we exalt Jesus when we act. That's why I think it's important that Paul adds this part where he talks about that Christ be exalted in my body. It's our actions. It's the words we speak. It's how we live. People will see Jesus through us in what we do every day. They will experience him. So what is Paul saying here? Paul is telling us that the one thing in his life, the number one thing in his life, is Jesus. And he sums it all up in verse 21 when he says, For to me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. That simply sums up everything about what Paul is trying to communicate here. You see, for Paul, the reason for living is Jesus. His purpose is Jesus. The most important thing in his life is Jesus. And even when death comes, he will embrace it because he actually knows that it's going to be better for him. And so I think this begs a question for us to examine today. What is the most important thing in your life? Let me just suggest some examples using Paul's formula. For me to live is my spouse. Fill in your spouse's name or your child's name in that blank. And then to die is to what? Leave them behind. For me to live is money, and to die is to leave it all to someone else. For me to live is fame, and to die is to be quickly forgotten. For me to live is power or influence, and to die is to lose both. For me to live is possessions, and to die is to depart with nothing in your hands. When Paul says to live is Christ, he's begging us to re-examine our lives. He's hoping that we will take the time to take stock of how we are living, the decisions we are making, what we hold as important. You see, he's had plenty of time to do this in prison. He's got nothing else to do, right? And this is, I think, his reflective answer. That for him, to live is Christ, and to die is gain. I think Christians sometimes fall into a trap. When God blesses our lives with a spouse, or with kids, or a home, or a career, or possessions, or RSPs, or investments, if we're not careful, we will let these things become what we live for. And in essence, that was one of the tests that Job had to go through. What's the most important thing in Job's life? Was it God, or was it his children, or his possessions, his flocks? If everything in your life, if you can answer all those things and go, yeah, no, Brent, Christ is still, the number one thing in my life. Let me ask you another question. What's your attitude towards death? Because you see, how you view death affects actually how you live life. And in our culture, death is often seen as probably the worst possible thing that can happen because it takes you from this life. And unless, of course, you're suffering, because then if you're suffering, then death is seen as a release. And both these perspectives come from a worldview that believes that if you claim there's something after death, that is just wishful thinking. Because you see, if there's nothing after death, then the way the world lives its life makes sense. You want to stay here as long as you can to enjoy whatever you have gotten, whatever little kingdom you have built up, whatever relationships you have made. You live as long as you can to enjoy them, because after death, it's all gone. Or if you are suffering or in pain, then death is the great release if there's nothing there. But death for a Christian is very different. We have a very different perspective because we know that after death there is something. There is life after death. Death is not the end. It is a doorway we step through. And for Christians, death is not a loss. And in fact, when we think of suffering, for Christians, suffering is viewed as a light and momentary trouble. Suffering actually helps us in preparing for death, but also helps us when we die and get into heaven, because we know a far better life awaits for us. So we look at death differently. And you can tell in Paul's words that he does not look at death like our culture looks at death. And verses 22 to 26 really is just the outworking of verse 21, where he's talking about to live as Christ and to die is to gain. And he basically lets us into this internal dialogue that he obviously had been having of whether it would be better to die or better to stay. And you kind of get the sense that for him, he knows it would be better for him to die, in the sense that it would be better for him personally, because he gets to be with Jesus. He's no longer in prison. He no longer has to suffer. But he weighs other things in that decision. And one of the things he weighs is the benefit to others. And he realizes that he needs to stay to continue the work that God has for him, because there's a benefit for others. He is willing to sacrifice himself for someone else. So when Paul says to live is Christ, what is he saying to us? I think there's a couple of things. The first is this, that Christ is all you need in life. Paul rephrases it in Colossians 3:4, where he says, Christ who is your life. Christ is your life. Christ is life. To live is Christ. Christ is all you need. Christ is the thing you've been looking for. And the other thing, when he says to live as Christ, he is telling us that how you live your life will either exalt Christ or it won't. And his commitment, himself personally, is to live in such a way that it will exalt, will magnify, it will draw people to Jesus. And then third, I think he's helping us understand, and this comes out in the dialogue in 22 to verses 26, that if we say to live as Christ, it means that we will have to deny ourselves in order to serve Christ. He would rather die and go to heaven, I think. But to serve, he's willing to give that up for a while and continue to stay in prison, continue to face death, because he's willing to endure those things. He's willing to give himself up. So it's a good thing to reflect on. And Paul's a great example to think that through. Are you denying yourself for Jesus? Because I would wager that if there's nothing in your life right now that you can point to that you're going, I'm doing this because God has called me to do this, and actually I would rather not, I'd rather do this or that, then you probably are just living for yourself. If you're not denying yourself for Jesus, I'm going to suggest that you're probably just living for yourself and not for him. Our vision as a church is to follow Jesus daily and intentionally take risks as we bravely live outward. In essence, that is Paul's to live is Christ. We could have just used those little words, that little phrase, to sum up our vision as a church, this vision that we're trying to live out, that we're launching into. Our vision as a church is to actually do what Paul was doing, to live as Christ. Let me bring the message full circle. If you asked Paul who completes him, his answer would have been what? His answer would have been Jesus, right? Paul tried to fill his life with other things before he met Jesus. He tried to fill it with working hard, by being good, by being zealous for his religion, all those things. He came up short. But when he met Jesus, he didn't need anything else. You see, when Paul met Jesus. He was complete. So whatever you're doing right now to fill your life, whatever you're running after, whatever you think is important, it will not fill your life. And whether it's your spouse, that fiance you have, whether it's children that you hope to have, whether it's a career or a job, or even trying to find security by having lots of money in the bank, none of that will fill your life. None of that will make you feel completed. It's only when you come to Jesus that you will be at that place. It's only when you can say the same thing Paul said, "For me to live is Christ." When there's nothing more important than Jesus. And it's when we can get to that place where we say, "For me to live is Christ and to die is gain," then we know that we have arrived where Paul had arrived. That it doesn't matter what happens to us in this life. It matters what happens to us in the next life. And we can face anything in this life when we know that what we're facing is we're doing it for Jesus. So I leave you with this question. Can you honestly say that for you to live is Christ? Let me pray. Dear Heavenly Father, I just want to thank you for these verses. I want to thank you for the challenge that it brings to us today. Lord, I pray for myself and for our church that we all would be able to echo Paul, that for us to live is you. Lord, I pray for those who might be struggling with other priorities in their life. I pray for others who are hanging on to things that are not you. Lord, I pray that they would have the courage to let those go and focus in on you. I also pray for those who maybe have just taken their eye off you and have instead inserted other things in that statement. And for them to live, it's whatever, a spouse or money or a job or some other thing. Lord, I pray that this is just a reminder to come back to you and keep you center of their life. Lord, I pray for those who are searching. And I would ask that those who know they are not complete, that they would find you, that they would come to the place to accept who you are, that you love them, that you died for them, and that you rose again. So Lord, help us to become a church that can say the same thing as Paul, that for us to live is Christ and to die is gain. Amen.